The Age of Exploration, also known as the Age of Discovery, marks one of the most transformative periods in human history, spanning roughly from the early 15th century to the 17th century. During this time, European nations embarked on an unprecedented series of expeditions that expanded the boundaries of the known world, connected distant continents, and forever changed the course of global history. What began as a search for new trade routes to the east evolved into a period of vast discovery that reshaped not only geography but also the economic, political, and cultural landscapes of Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The dawn of this era was driven by a combination of factors that converged to create a perfect storm of ambition, curiosity, and necessity. European nations, particularly Portugal and Spain, were motivated by the desire to bypass the overland trade routes controlled by powerful Ottoman and Venetian merchants. These routes had long been the lifeblood of Europe's access to valuable goods such as spices, silk, and precious metals from the East. However, with increasing control and taxation along these routes, European nations sought alternative means to directly access the lucrative markets of India, China, and the Spice Islands, modern-day Indonesia. Alongside these economic motivations were the religious and political forces shaping Europe at the time. The Catholic Church, recovering from the challenges of the Crusades and the schism within Christianity, was eager to spread its influence to new lands. Missionaries and monarchs alike viewed exploration as an opportunity to spread Christianity and counter the spread of Islam, which had become a powerful force in the Mediterranean and beyond. The spirit of Reconquista, which saw the Christian kingdoms of Spain reclaiming territory from Muslim rule, further fueled a sense of expansion and conquest. However, it was not merely the desire for wealth and religious conversion that sparked the Age of Exploration. The Renaissance, which began in Italy and spread throughout Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries, had ushered in a new era of intellectual curiosity and scientific advancement. Renaissance thinkers placed a renewed emphasis on human potential and the pursuit of knowledge. This intellectual revival was accompanied by significant technological innovations that made long-distance sea travel more feasible. Advances in cartography, navigation, and shipbuilding transformed what had once been perilous voyages into calculated and strategic journeys of exploration. Among the most crucial innovations were improvements in ship design. The development of the caravel, a highly maneuverable and durable sailing vessel, allowed European explorers to navigate previously inaccessible waters. The caravel, with its lateen sails that could sail against the wind, was lighter and faster than previous ships, making it ideal for long voyages across open seas. Additionally, the use of the astrolabe and magnetic compass gave sailors the ability to determine their position relative to the stars and the Earth's magnetic field, greatly improving their chances of successfully navigating vast oceans. These technological advancements, coupled with the growing ambition of European monarchs and the intellectual curiosity of the Renaissance, set the stage for what would become a period of unprecedented exploration. The earliest explorers, many of them Portuguese, began their journeys along the coast of Africa, slowly mapping the continent and establishing trading posts. These voyages were not only motivated by the search for new trade routes to the east, but also by the quest to tap into the wealth of West African gold, ivory, and other resources. Portugal, under the guidance of Prince Henry the Navigator, was at the forefront of these early explorations. Prince Henry, though he never sailed himself, was instrumental in fostering an environment that encouraged exploration. He established a school of navigation at Sagres, where the best sailors, cartographers, and shipbuilders gathered to share knowledge and develop the skills necessary for long-distance voyages. With this support, Portuguese explorers began to push further south along the African coast, culminating in Bartolomeu Dias's successful rounding of the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, which opened the door to the Indian Ocean. While the Portuguese led the early charge, it was the Spanish crown that would soon embark on some of the most famous voyages of discovery. In 1492, under the sponsorship of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, an ambitious Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus set out westward across the Atlantic Ocean, hoping to reach Asia by a direct route. Instead of reaching the fabled lands of the East, Columbus stumbled upon a new world, the Americas. Though Columbus never realized the full significance of his discovery, his voyage marked the beginning of a new era of exploration and conquest that would forever alter the course of history. The voyages of Columbus, and those that followed in his wake, opened up vast new territories for European powers to explore, colonize, and exploit. The discovery of the Americas, along with the successful rounding of the Cape of Good Hope by Vasco da Gama in 1498, marked the beginning of a truly global age, where trade, culture, and knowledge flowed between continents on an unprecedented scale. Over the next 2 centuries, explorers such as Ferdinand Magellan, Hernán Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, and Sir Francis Drake would push the boundaries of the known world even further, mapping uncharted territories and encountering diverse cultures that had been previously unknown to Europeans. The impact of the Age of Exploration was profound and far-reaching. It not only transformed the political and economic landscape of Europe, but also led to the establishment of new trade routes that connected distant regions of the world. The Columbian Exchange, which saw the transfer of goods, plants, animals, and diseases between the Old World and the New, reshaped agriculture, cuisine, and populations on a global scale. The introduction of crops such as potatoes, maize, and tomatoes to Europe, and the exchange of European livestock and crops to the Americas, had lasting consequences for societies around the world. However, the Age of Exploration was not without its darker side. The encounter between European explorers and indigenous peoples often led to violent conquest, enslavement, and the decimation of native populations through disease and exploitation. The establishment of European colonies in the Americas, Africa, and Asia created vast empires that fueled the rise of mercantilism, but also perpetuated systems of slavery and exploitation that would have lasting repercussions for centuries to come. As we embark on this journey through the Age of Exploration, we will delve deeply into the lives of the explorers, the motivations behind their voyages, and the discoveries they made along the way. We will explore the challenges they faced at sea, the technological innovations that made their journeys possible, and the impact their discoveries had on the world. Through a calming and detailed narrative, we will sail across the oceans, visit distant shores, and uncover the fascinating history of one of humanity's most transformative eras. Chapter 1: The Early Explorers and the Quest for New Trade Routes. The dawn of the Age of Exploration was shaped by the quest for new trade routes, driven by the desire to access the riches of the East: spices, silk, precious metals, and other valuable goods. For centuries, these goods had flowed into Europe through overland routes known as the Silk Road, which stretched from China and India across Central Asia to the Mediterranean. However, these routes were long, dangerous, and controlled by powerful intermediaries, particularly the Ottoman Empire and Venetian merchants, who imposed heavy taxes on the goods they transported. By the early 15th century, European nations were eager to find alternative sea routes that would allow them to bypass these intermediaries and trade directly with the East. At the forefront of this early exploration was Portugal, a small but ambitious nation situated at the western edge of Europe. Under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese embarked on a series of expeditions that would open up new trade routes and expand their influence beyond the Iberian Peninsula. Prince Henry, although he never sailed on any of these expeditions himself, was instrumental in fostering a spirit of exploration by sponsoring voyages, gathering the best navigators and cartographers of the time, and encouraging the development of new maritime technologies. Prince Henry's vision was to reach the fabled riches of West Africa, particularly its gold, ivory, and slaves, which had long been coveted by European merchants. The Portuguese believed that by navigating around the western coast of Africa, they could establish direct trade with these wealthy regions, bypassing the overland routes controlled by Muslim traders. To achieve this, they needed to map the coast of Africa, a task that had not yet been accomplished by any European power. In 1419, under Prince Henry's sponsorship, the Portuguese began exploring the Atlantic islands, starting with the rediscovery of Madeira. Shortly after, in the 1420s, Portuguese expeditions charted the uninhabited Azores archipelago, which later became important bases for further exploration. These early voyages were successful in establishing Portuguese claims over strategic territories and demonstrated the potential of maritime exploration to expand their reach. However, the true challenge lay in venturing further south along the western coast of Africa. The Portuguese knew little about the geography of the region beyond the Cape Bojador, a fearsome headland located on the coast of modern-day Western Sahara. For centuries, this cape had been regarded as the point of no return, where the seas were believed to be treacherous and unnavigable. Early attempts to round the cape had ended in failure, reinforcing the belief that the African coast was impenetrable. But Prince Henry was undeterred. He believed that by applying scientific principles to navigation and by continuing to improve their ship designs, the Portuguese could overcome the challenges of the African coast. He assembled a team of skilled navigators and cartographers at his School of Navigation in Sagres, on the southern tip of Portugal, where they studied the winds, currents, and stars to develop more reliable methods of navigation. One of the key innovations that emerged during this time was the development of the caravel, a new type of ship that was lighter, faster, and more maneuverable than earlier vessels. The caravel featured a distinctive design with its lateen sails, which allowed it to sail against the wind, making it ideal for exploring the often unpredictable Atlantic waters. This ship became the workhorse of Portuguese exploration, enabling longer and more ambitious voyages along the African coast. In 1434, a breakthrough was achieved when the Portuguese explorer Gil Yanes, under Prince Henry's orders, successfully rounded Cape Bojador. This was a monumental moment in the history of exploration, as it opened up the coast of Africa to further exploration and trade. Yanes's voyage proved that the fears surrounding the Cape were unfounded, and that it was possible to sail beyond it and return safely. This success marked the beginning of a series of expeditions that would gradually push further south along the African coast, each voyage revealing new opportunities for trade and discovery. By the mid-15th century, Portuguese explorers had reached as far south as the Gulf of Guinea, establishing trading posts and fortresses along the coast. These posts became hubs of trade between the Portuguese and African kingdoms, exchanging European goods such as textiles and weapons for gold, ivory, and enslaved people. The Portuguese monopoly on this trade route brought immense wealth to the nation and solidified its position as a leading maritime power. One of the most significant figures during this period was the explorer Diogo Cao, who in 1482 sailed further along the African coast than any European had before. Cao's voyages took him to the mouth of the Congo River, where he made contact with the powerful Kingdom of Congo. This marked the beginning of a relationship between the Portuguese and the Congo that would last for centuries, with both trade and religious missions playing a central role in their interactions. While the Portuguese had made great strides in exploring the western coast of Africa, their ultimate goal was to find a sea route to India and the Spice Islands. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were highly prized in Europe, not only for their flavor, but also for their use in medicine and food preservation. Controlling the spice trade promised immense wealth, and the Portuguese were determined to find a way to bypass the overland routes that brought these goods from the east through the Middle East. The man who would finally achieve this goal was Vasco da Gama, one of the most famous explorers of the Age of Exploration. In 1497, da Gama set sail from Lisbon with a fleet of 4 ships, aiming to round the southern tip of Africa and reach India by sea. His voyage was perilous, taking him through the rough seas of the Atlantic and around the treacherous Cape of Good Hope. However, da Gama's perseverance paid off, and in 1498 he became the first European to reach the shores of India by sea. Da Gama's arrival in Calicut, a major trading city on the southwest coast of India, was a momentous event in global history. For the first time, European merchants had direct access to the markets of the East, allowing them to bypass the overland routes controlled by Muslim traders. This direct sea route opened the door for further Portuguese expeditions to India, the Spice Islands, and beyond, cementing Portugal's position as a dominant maritime and trading power in the 16th century. The early voyages of exploration, led by Portugal, were the foundation upon which the Age of Exploration was built. These expeditions not only expanded European knowledge of the world, but also established the framework for global trade and the exchange of goods, cultures, and ideas. The discovery of new trade routes, particularly the sea route to India, marked the beginning of a new era in which European nations would compete for control of global commerce and territory, setting the stage for the next chapter of exploration, the discovery of the New World. The early Portuguese explorations along the African coast and their eventual success in reaching India exemplified the spirit of the Age of Exploration, a combination of ambition, curiosity, and determination to push beyond the known boundaries of the world. It was this spirit that would soon inspire other European powers, particularly Spain, to embark on their own voyages of discovery, forever changing the course of history. Chapter 2: Christopher Columbus and the Discovery of the New World. By the late 15th century, the Portuguese had successfully charted much of the western coast of Africa and found a sea route to India, opening up new avenues for trade and wealth. However, the tantalizing idea of reaching the East by sailing west still lingered in the minds of some of Europe's most ambitious explorers. Among them was an Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus, whose bold vision of finding a westward route to Asia would lead not to the shores of the East, but to the discovery of an entirely new continent. Born in Genoa, Italy, around 1451, Columbus was raised in a bustling Mediterranean port city, where he was exposed to the seafaring world from a young age. His early experiences as a sailor and merchant gave him a deep fascination with the ocean and the possibilities it held for exploration. As a young man, Columbus became well versed in navigation, learning from seasoned sailors and studying maps and charts that depicted the known world. However, like many of his contemporaries, he knew that vast parts of the world remained uncharted, and the mysterious lands that lay beyond the Atlantic Ocean captured his imagination. In the 15th century, most European navigators believed that the Earth was round, but the exact size of the globe and the distance between Europe and Asia were subjects of debate. Based on his calculations and the writings of ancient scholars such as Ptolemy, Columbus believed that Asia could be reached by sailing westward across the Atlantic. He was convinced that the world was smaller than most geographers believed, and that a relatively short voyage would take him to the lucrative markets of the East. Despite his confidence in this plan, Columbus faced significant challenges in securing funding for such a voyage. For years, he petitioned the courts of Europe, seeking financial backing for his expedition. Both the Portuguese and English monarchs rejected his proposals, believing that Columbus had grossly underestimated the size of the Atlantic Ocean and the dangers it posed. Undeterred, Columbus turned to Spain, where he eventually found an audience with Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand. At the time, Spain was emerging as a powerful and unified kingdom, having recently completed the Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to expel Muslim rulers from the Iberian Peninsula. With their attention now turning to matters of exploration and expansion, Isabella and Ferdinand saw potential in Columbus's proposal. They agreed to sponsor his voyage, hoping that if he succeeded, Spain could gain access to the wealth of the East and compete with Portugal's growing dominance in the spice trade. On August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail from the port of Palos de la Frontera with 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña. His crew was made up of sailors, craftsmen, and adventurers, many of whom were anxious about the voyage ahead. The Atlantic Ocean, often referred to as the Sea of Darkness, was filled with unknown dangers, and there were fears that the ships would sail off the edge of the earth or encounter monstrous sea creatures. However, Columbus remained resolute, convinced that the rewards of the journey outweighed the risks. As the ships ventured farther into the Atlantic, the crew's anxiety grew. Weeks passed with no sight of land, and supplies began to dwindle. The vastness of the ocean, with its seemingly endless expanse of water, was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The crew became increasingly restless, and there were whispers of mutiny. Columbus, however, maintained his leadership and reassured his men that land was near. On October 12, 1492, after nearly 2 months at sea, a lookout on the Pinta sighted land. The crew rejoiced, and the ships made landfall on an island in what is now the Bahamas. Columbus, believing he had reached islands off the coast of Asia, named the island San Salvador. The exact location of this landfall has been the subject of historical debate, but it marked the beginning of one of the most significant events in world history, the encounter between Europe and the Americas. Columbus and his men were greeted by the indigenous people, whom he mistakenly referred to as Indians, believing he had reached the outskirts of the Indian subcontinent. The indigenous population, later identified as the Taino people, were initially curious and welcoming. Columbus's accounts describe them as generous and peaceful, willing to trade goods such as cotton, parrots, and small amounts of gold with the Europeans. The peaceful exchanges between the two groups were among the earliest interactions between Europeans and the native populations of the Americas. Columbus was struck by the beauty of the islands he had discovered. He described the lush landscapes, the clear waters, and the abundance of natural resources, noting the potential for future exploration and settlement. He was particularly interested in the presence of gold, believing that larger quantities could be found on other nearby islands. Columbus continued his voyage, exploring the islands of the Caribbean, including present-day Cuba and Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic. He was convinced that he was nearing the coast of Asia, and that the wealth of the East was within his reach. However, as Columbus explored further, it became increasingly clear that the lands he had discovered were not part of Asia, but a previously unknown part of the world. Still, Columbus remained convinced that he had found a new route to the east, and he returned to Spain in March 1493 with news of his discovery. He was hailed as a hero, and the Spanish court celebrated the success of his voyage. Isabella and Ferdinand, eager to capitalize on the potential wealth of these new lands, quickly arranged for further expeditions to the Americas. In the years that followed, Columbus made 3 more voyages to the New World, each time exploring new territories and establishing Spanish settlements. However, his belief that he had found a route to Asia persisted, even as evidence mounted that he had in fact discovered a completely new continent. Despite his insistence, other explorers, including Amerigo Vespucci, began to recognize that the lands Columbus had encountered were part of a vast new world, separate from Asia. It was Vespucci's accounts that ultimately led to the naming of the Americas in his honor. The impact of Columbus's voyages was immense. His expeditions opened the door to further exploration, conquest, and colonization of the Americas by European powers. Spain, in particular, rapidly expanded its empire in the New World, establishing colonies in the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. The wealth extracted from these colonies, particularly in the form of gold and silver, fueled Spain's rise as a dominant European power in the 16th century. The Columbian Exchange, the widespread transfer of goods, crops, animals, and diseases between the Old World and the New, had far-reaching consequences for both Europe and the Americas. European crops such as wheat, barley, and sugarcane were introduced to the Americas, while American crops such as maize, potatoes, and tomatoes were brought back to Europe. These crops transformed diets and agricultural practices on both sides of the Atlantic. However, the exchange was not without its darker side. European diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza devastated indigenous populations in the Americas, leading to a dramatic decline in their numbers. The introduction of slavery, particularly the transatlantic slave trade, also had a lasting impact on the Americas and Africa. While Columbus's legacy is often viewed through a complex lens, with both positive and negative aspects, there is no denying the significance of his voyages. He connected 2 worlds that had previously been isolated from one another, setting in motion a series of events that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. The discovery of the New World marked the beginning of the European colonization of the Americas, the expansion of global trade, and the eventual rise of European empires that would dominate much of the world in the centuries that followed. As we look back on Columbus's voyages, we are reminded of the audacity and ambition that drove him to sail into the unknown. His journeys were fraught with danger and uncertainty, yet they opened up a new chapter in human history, one in which the world became interconnected in ways that were previously unimaginable. While the consequences of his discoveries were far-reaching and often devastating for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, they also marked the beginning of a new era of exploration and discovery that would continue to shape the world for generations. Chapter 3: Ferdinand Magellan and the First Circumnavigation of the Globe. The early 16th century was a time of unparalleled exploration and discovery, with European powers racing to expand their influence across the globe. In the wake of Christopher Columbus's voyages and the subsequent discovery of the New World, explorers were increasingly drawn to the idea of finding a direct sea route to the Spice Islands, the fabled source of the most valuable spices in the world. While Portuguese navigators had successfully charted a route around the Cape of Good Hope to India and the East, one man, Ferdinand Magellan, set his sights on a different, even more ambitious path, sailing westward around the world. Born into a noble family in Portugal in 1480, Ferdinand Magellan grew up in an era of intense maritime activity. As a young man, he served in the Portuguese Navy and participated in several expeditions to the East Indies, where he gained valuable experience in navigation, sailing, and combat. These early voyages kindled a deep fascination with the wider world and a determination to find new routes to the wealth of the East. However, after falling out of favor with the Portuguese court over disputes regarding his military service, Magellan turned to Spain to support his bold new venture. Magellan's vision was audacious. He believed that by sailing westward across the Atlantic and navigating around South America, he could reach the Spice Islands in the east without having to compete with the Portuguese-controlled eastern route. This would not only allow Spain to access the lucrative spice trade, but also open up new territories for Spanish influence. His plan was fraught with uncertainty. No European had ever sailed around the southern tip of South America, and the size and scope of the Pacific Ocean were unknown. Yet Magellan was undeterred, convinced that the rewards far outweighed the risks. In 1518, after securing the support of King Charles I of Spain, Magellan was given command of an expedition to find a westward route to the Spice Islands. His fleet, consisting of 5 ships, the Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago, set sail from the port of Seville on September 20th, 1519. His crew, numbering around 270 men, was made up of sailors from various European nations, including Spaniards, Portuguese, and Italians. Many of the sailors were anxious about the unknown voyage ahead, as rumors of treacherous seas, distant lands, and dangerous peoples swirled around them. Nevertheless, Magellan's leadership and experience inspired confidence as the fleet headed out into the Atlantic. The early stages of the voyage were relatively uneventful, with the fleet crossing the Atlantic and reaching the coast of South America by late December 1519. After making landfall in what is now Brazil, Magellan's fleet sailed southward along the eastern coast of South America, searching for a passage through the continent that would lead them to the Pacific Ocean. As they journeyed further south, the weather became colder, and the seas grew rougher, testing the endurance of both the ships and the crew. It was during this phase of the voyage that Magellan's leadership was severely tested. Tensions among the crew began to rise, particularly between the Spanish and Portuguese sailors, some of whom resented taking orders from a Portuguese captain in the service of Spain. The harsh conditions, the uncertainty of the journey, and the fear of the unknown led to growing unrest. In April 1520, as the fleet wintered in a sheltered bay known as San Julian, in what is now Argentina, a full-scale mutiny broke out. 3 of the 5 ships, San Antonio, Concepcion, and Victoria, rose in rebellion, led by their Spanish captains. Magellan, though outnumbered, acted swiftly and decisively to quell the mutiny. He ordered the arrest of the mutineers, and personally led a group of loyal sailors to retake the ships. In the aftermath of the mutiny, the leaders were executed, and the remaining sailors were disciplined. Magellan's firm handling of the situation re-established his authority, but it also deepened the divisions among the crew. Nevertheless, the fleet pressed on, determined to find the elusive passage to the Pacific. In October 1520, after months of searching and facing near-constant storms, Magellan's fleet finally discovered the narrow strait that would later bear his name, the Strait of Magellan. This natural passage, located near the southern tip of South America, was treacherous and winding, with rocky shores and unpredictable currents. Yet Magellan's determination never wavered. For 38 days, the fleet navigated the strait, battling harsh winds and the frigid waters of the Southern Ocean. As they emerged from the strait into the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the crew experienced a moment of awe and relief. They had accomplished what no European had done before, found a western route to the great ocean that lay beyond the Americas. However, the journey was far from over. Unbeknownst to Magellan and his men, the Pacific was much larger than they had anticipated, and their ordeal was just beginning. The crossing of the Pacific would prove to be one of the most grueling and harrowing experiences in the history of exploration. For more than 3 months, Magellan's fleet sailed across the vast, uncharted waters of the Pacific, with no sight of land. The Pacific, true to its name, remained relatively calm during this leg of the journey, but the sheer distance and isolation took a heavy toll on the crew. Supplies ran dangerously low, and the sailors were forced to ration what little food and water they had left. Hunger and scurvy, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, began to ravage the crew. Men grew weak, and many died as the fleet drifted across the open ocean. Despite the desperate conditions, Magellan remained focused on his goal, guiding his fleet westward with unwavering determination. His navigational skills, honed during his years of service in the East Indies, were crucial in keeping the ships on course through the vast and empty Pacific. Finally, in March 1521, after months of suffering, the fleet sighted land. They had reached the islands of Guam in the Mariana Islands, marking the end of their treacherous Pacific crossing. The crew was able to resupply and recover, though their numbers had been greatly diminished. From Guam, the fleet continued westward, eventually reaching the Philippines, a group of islands that lay on the western edge of the Pacific, close to the Spice Islands that had been Magellan's ultimate goal. In the Philippines, Magellan established friendly relations with local rulers and began to explore the islands. However, his time in the Philippines would be cut short by a tragic and fateful encounter. In April 1521, while assisting a local chief in a conflict against a rival tribe on the island of Mactan, Magellan was killed in battle. His death, at the age of 41, marked the end of his personal journey but not the end of his expedition's mission. After Magellan's death, leadership of the expedition passed to his loyal officers, including the Spanish navigator Juan Sebastián Elcano. Under Elcano's command, the fleet continued westward, determined to complete the circumnavigation of the globe. In November 1521, the fleet finally reached the Spice Islands, fulfilling Magellan's goal of finding a western route to the east. After trading for spices, the remaining crew set sail for home, navigating through the Indian Ocean and around the Cape of Good Hope. Of the 5 ships that had originally set out from Spain, only one, the Victoria, survived the journey back. On September 6, 1522, nearly 3 years after they had departed, the Victoria arrived in Spain, completing the first circumnavigation of the globe. Of the original 270 crew members, only 18 returned. Their harrowing journey, marked by mutiny, hardship, and the death of their leader, had forever changed the world's understanding of the Earth's size and geography. Magellan's expedition was a monumental achievement. It proved beyond doubt that the Earth was round and that the oceans were interconnected. The circumnavigation of the globe marked the beginning of a new era in global exploration, trade, and colonization. It opened up new routes for European powers to explore and exploit, and it paved the way for future expeditions that would continue to push the boundaries of the known world. Magellan's legacy as one of the greatest explorers in history is undeniable. His vision, leadership, and navigational skills were instrumental in achieving the first circumnavigation of the globe, even though he did not live to see its completion. His journey revealed the vastness of the Pacific Ocean and confirmed the existence of new trade routes that would shape the course of global history for centuries to come. The impact of Magellan's voyage was profound. It expanded Europe's understanding of the world and its geography, providing crucial information about the size of the oceans and the location of previously unknown lands. The expedition also demonstrated the potential for global trade, connecting Europe with the Spice Islands, the Americas, and the Pacific. Over time, this interconnectedness would fuel the rise of European empires, the spread of new technologies and ideas, and the development of a truly global economy. Though Magellan's voyage was fraught with peril, it stands as a testament to the courage and determination of the explorers who braved the unknown in search of new horizons. It reminds us of the human desire to explore, to push beyond the boundaries of the familiar, and to discover what lies beyond the horizon. The first circumnavigation of the globe was not just a triumph of navigation and exploration. It was a defining moment in human history, one that opened the door to a new era of global interaction and exchange. Chapter 4. The Exchange of Cultures, Goods, and Ideas. The age of exploration, driven by the ambitions of European powers to expand their influence and control over trade, did more than just chart new routes across the world. It fundamentally changed the way different parts of the world interacted, leading to the exchange of goods, cultures, ideas, and technologies on an unprecedented scale. The interactions between Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia reshaped global societies, economies, and the environment. This exchange, commonly referred to as the Columbian Exchange, had far-reaching and sometimes unintended consequences that altered the trajectory of human history. At the heart of this global exchange was the desire for valuable goods. European explorers were initially motivated by a quest for spices, gold, silver, and other luxury items that were in high demand in Europe. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg had long been prized in European cuisine and medicine, but these items were difficult to obtain. The overland routes through the Middle East were controlled by Muslim traders, and the prices of these goods were often driven up by the time they reached European markets. European nations, particularly Spain and Portugal, were eager to find alternative, sea-based routes that would allow them to bypass these intermediaries and trade directly with the source. When European explorers ventured into new territories, they encountered not only new landscapes but also new peoples, cultures, and goods. The discovery of the Americas in 1492 by Christopher Columbus set in motion a vast exchange of goods and ideas between the Old World, Europe, Africa, and Asia, and the New World, the Americas. This exchange would come to be known as the Columbian Exchange, and it fundamentally transformed the world in ways that were both positive and negative. The exchange of crops and foods, a global agricultural revolution. One of the most significant aspects of the Columbian Exchange was the transfer of crops and agricultural products between the Old World and the New. Before European contact, the Americas had developed a rich and diverse array of crops, many of which were unknown to the rest of the world. Among the most important crops introduced to Europe, Africa, and Asia were maize, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, squash, cacao, the source of chocolate, and tobacco. These crops had a profound impact on the diets and agricultural practices of people across the globe. Maize and potatoes, in particular, became staples in many parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Maize, originally cultivated in Central America, spread rapidly across the world due to its adaptability to different climates. It became a vital crop in Africa and China, where it was used to feed growing populations. Potatoes, native to the Andean region of South America, were introduced to Europe in the 16th century and quickly became a dietary staple. Potatoes were well suited to the cool, wet climates of northern Europe, and their high caloric content made them an ideal food for sustaining large populations. In places like Ireland, the potato became so important that it eventually became central to the country's agricultural system. The introduction of these New World crops to the Old World had far-reaching consequences for global food production and population growth. The increased availability of nutritious, high-yield crops like maize and potatoes contributed to significant population growth in Europe, Africa, and Asia, as these crops could sustain large populations even in regions with poor soil or harsh climates. This, in turn, had economic and social implications, as the availability of new food sources allowed for larger urban populations, increased trade, and shifts in labor practices. In return, the Old World introduced a variety of crops and livestock to the Americas. Wheat, barley, rice, and sugarcane were brought to the New World, where they were cultivated in the rich soils of the Americas. The introduction of wheat, in particular, transformed the agricultural landscape of North and South America, as it became a staple crop in regions such as the Great Plains and the Pampas. Sugarcane, originally from Southeast Asia, was introduced to the Caribbean and Brazil, where it became the backbone of the plantation economy. Along with these crops came domesticated animals, which had a transformative effect on the Americas. Horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats were all introduced to the New World, where they thrived in the open grasslands and plains. The introduction of horses had a particularly profound impact on the indigenous peoples of the Americas. In regions such as the Great Plains of North America, the horse revolutionized hunting, transportation, and warfare, giving rise to powerful nomadic cultures such as the Comanche and Sioux. However, the exchange of crops and livestock also had unintended ecological consequences. The introduction of European crops and animals disrupted native ecosystems, leading to the displacement of indigenous plants and animals. In some cases, invasive species brought by European settlers outcompeted native species, altering the natural balance of the environment. European settlers also cleared vast tracts of land for agriculture, leading to deforestation and soil degradation in some areas. The spread of technology and knowledge. In addition to the exchange of crops and livestock, the age of exploration facilitated the spread of technology, knowledge, and ideas between different parts of the world. European explorers, missionaries, and settlers brought with them advanced technologies such as firearms, steel tools, and shipbuilding techniques, which had a significant impact on the societies they encountered. Firearms, in particular, played a crucial role in the European conquest of the Americas. The superior firepower of European armies, combined with their use of horses and steel weapons, gave them a decisive advantage over indigenous peoples who relied on traditional weapons such as bows, arrows, and spears. This technological superiority allowed relatively small European forces to conquer vast territories and subjugate large indigenous populations. However, the transfer of technology was not a one-way street. Europeans also learned from the peoples they encountered during their explorations. Indigenous peoples of the Americas, for example, taught European settlers how to cultivate crops such as maize, potatoes, and tobacco, which were unfamiliar to them. In North America, the indigenous practice of using fish as fertilizer to enrich the soil was adopted by European settlers, improving agricultural yields. The exchange of knowledge also extended to the realm of medicine. European explorers and settlers were introduced to new medicinal plants used by indigenous peoples, some of which had healing properties that were previously unknown in Europe. The bark of the cinchona tree, for example, was used by indigenous peoples in South America to treat malaria. European settlers quickly adopted this remedy, and quinine, the active ingredient in the bark, became a key treatment for malaria in the 17th and 18th centuries. The exchange of knowledge and technology was not limited to the Americas. The establishment of European trade routes to Africa, India, and East Asia brought about a flow of ideas and innovations between different civilizations. The arrival of European traders in India, for example, introduced new shipbuilding techniques and navigational tools that enhanced Indian maritime trade. In return, European merchants and explorers were introduced to advanced mathematical and astronomical knowledge from the Islamic world, China, and India, which had a profound impact on European science and navigation. The cultural exchange, religion, language, and art. The age of exploration also facilitated a profound exchange of cultures, beliefs, and artistic traditions between different parts of the world. One of the most significant aspects of this cultural exchange was the spread of religion, particularly Christianity, as European missionaries sought to convert indigenous peoples in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Spanish and Portuguese missionaries, often accompanying explorers and settlers, played a central role in the religious conversion of indigenous peoples. In the Americas, the Catholic Church established missions and religious institutions throughout the colonies, where they sought to convert indigenous populations to Christianity. These efforts were often met with varying degrees of success. In some regions, indigenous peoples adopted Christianity, while in others, they resisted or incorporated Christian beliefs into their existing spiritual practices. In Africa and Asia, European missionaries faced different challenges. In many parts of Africa, Islam had already established a strong presence, particularly in the northern and eastern regions. European missionaries in these areas often found themselves in competition with Muslim traders and scholars who were spreading Islam through trade and education. In East Asia, particularly in China and Japan, European missionaries encountered sophisticated and established religious and philosophical traditions, such as Confucianism and Buddhism. While Christian missionaries made some inroads, their efforts were often limited by political resistance and cultural differences. The exchange of cultures was not limited to religion. Language, art, and literature also flowed between different parts of the world. European settlers in the Americas, for example, were exposed to indigenous art forms such as pottery, weaving, and beadwork, which influenced colonial artistic traditions. In return, European artistic styles such as Baroque and Renaissance painting were introduced to the New World, where they were often adapted to local traditions and materials. Language also played a crucial role in the cultural exchange between Europe and the rest of the world. European languages, particularly Spanish, Portuguese, and English, spread throughout the Americas, Africa, and Asia as European settlers established colonies and trading posts. In the Americas, indigenous languages such as Nahuatl, Quechua, and Tupi were gradually replaced or blended with European languages, giving rise to new Creole languages and dialects. In Africa, the spread of European languages, particularly Portuguese and French, facilitated trade and communication between different regions. The exchange of cultures, however, was not always peaceful or voluntary. The spread of European languages, religions, and cultural practices was often accompanied by violence, coercion, and the suppression of indigenous traditions. European colonizers imposed their beliefs and values on indigenous peoples, sometimes forcibly, leading to the erosion of traditional cultures and ways of life. The impact on indigenous peoples, conquest and disease. While the exchange of goods, crops, and ideas brought about significant changes to the world, the impact of the Age of Exploration on indigenous peoples was often devastating. The arrival of European explorers and settlers in the Americas, Africa, and Asia led to the conquest and colonization of vast territories, often accompanied by violence, enslavement, and the spread of diseases that decimated indigenous populations. One of the most catastrophic consequences of the Columbian Exchange was the introduction of Old World diseases to the New World. Indigenous peoples in the Americas had no immunity to diseases such as smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus, which had been present in Europe, Africa, and Asia for centuries. These diseases spread rapidly among indigenous populations, causing massive mortality rates. In some regions, entire communities were wiped out within a few years of contact with Europeans. It is estimated that the indigenous population of the Americas declined by as much as 90% in the century following Columbus's arrival, making the introduction of Old World diseases one of the greatest demographic disasters in human history. In addition to disease, European conquest and colonization often involved the forced displacement and enslavement of indigenous peoples. In the Caribbean, Central America, and South America, Spanish and Portuguese colonizers established large plantations and mining operations that relied on the labor of enslaved indigenous peoples. The encomienda system, implemented by the Spanish in their colonies, allowed Spanish settlers to claim land and demand labor from indigenous communities in exchange for protection and religious instruction. In practice, this system led to widespread exploitation and abuse of indigenous peoples, many of whom were forced to work in brutal conditions. The impact of European colonization on indigenous societies was profound and long-lasting. Traditional ways of life were disrupted, political and social structures were dismantled, and indigenous cultures were often marginalized or suppressed. Despite these challenges, many indigenous peoples resisted European domination, preserving their cultural practices, languages, and beliefs in the face of colonization. The global impact of the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange was a turning point in world history, marking the beginning of a new era of global interaction and exchange. The flow of goods, crops, technologies, and ideas between Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas transformed economies, societies, and cultures on a global scale. The introduction of New World crops to the Old World contributed to population growth and economic development, while the spread of European technologies and ideas had a lasting impact on the societies they encountered. However, the Columbian Exchange also brought about significant challenges and disruptions. The introduction of Old World diseases to the New World decimated indigenous populations, while European colonization and the transatlantic slave trade led to widespread exploitation and suffering. The environmental impact of the exchange, particularly the introduction of invasive species and the expansion of European agricultural practices, altered ecosystems and landscapes in ways that are still felt today. As we reflect on the Columbian Exchange and its consequences, we are reminded of the complex and interconnected nature of global history. The age of exploration was a time of discovery, innovation, and cultural exchange. But it was also a time of conquest, exploitation, and profound loss. The legacies of this period continue to shape the world we live in today, as we navigate the challenges and opportunities of a globally connected world. Chapter 5. The Impact on Indigenous Peoples and New Encounters. The age of exploration, while hailed in European history as a time of discovery, progress, and expansion, had deep and often devastating consequences for the indigenous peoples of the lands that European explorers discovered. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas, Africa, and Asia led to encounters that were characterized by curiosity and exchange, but also by conquest, exploitation, and profound cultural disruption. Indigenous societies, some of which had flourished for thousands of years before European contact, faced dramatic and often violent upheavals as a result of this new era of exploration. While Europeans were motivated by wealth, trade, religious zeal, and political ambitions, the indigenous peoples they encountered had their own complex societies, systems of government, religions, and ways of life. These civilizations were by no means monolithic, ranging from highly centralized empires like the Aztecs and Incas to smaller nomadic communities spread across vast regions. Each group had its own experience of European contact, but for many, this period brought with it not just new goods and technologies, but also war, disease, enslavement, and the loss of autonomy. In this chapter, we will delve into the encounters between European explorers and indigenous peoples, exploring the early exchanges, the long-term impacts of colonization, and the profound consequences for the cultures and societies of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. We will also examine the ways in which indigenous peoples resisted, adapted to, and survived the dramatic changes brought about by the Age of Exploration. The early encounters, curiosity, and exchange. When European explorers first arrived in the Americas, they were greeted by indigenous peoples who were as curious about these strange newcomers as the Europeans were about them. The initial encounters were often peaceful, characterized by mutual curiosity, exchange, and an effort to understand one another. Christopher Columbus, during his first voyage in 1492, described the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean as generous and welcoming, eager to trade goods such as cotton, parrots, and gold in exchange for European trinkets and tools. In the early stages of contact, indigenous peoples introduced Europeans to new crops, animals, and materials that would have a profound impact on global trade and agriculture. Maize, potatoes, tobacco, cacao, and tomatoes were all native to the Americas and were unknown to Europe before the Columbian Exchange. In return, Europeans introduced horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep to the Americas, along with crops such as wheat, barley, and sugarcane. These early exchanges were not limited to goods. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, Africa, and Asia had developed complex systems of knowledge in agriculture, medicine, and engineering, some of which Europeans eagerly adopted. Indigenous farming techniques, such as the use of irrigation systems and terracing in the Andes, impressed European settlers, while traditional medicinal plants used by indigenous healers were incorporated into European pharmacology. However, beneath this initial spirit of exchange and cooperation lay the seeds of conflict. European explorers and settlers viewed the lands they discovered as potential sources of wealth and resources, often disregarding the sovereignty of the indigenous peoples who inhabited them. The European concept of land ownership, where land could be claimed, bought, and sold, was foreign to many indigenous societies, where land was often seen as communal property, tied to spiritual beliefs and ancestral heritage. As European settlers began to lay claim to indigenous lands, tensions between the two groups began to rise. The impact of disease. The silent conqueror. One of the most devastating consequences of European exploration was the introduction of Old World diseases to the indigenous populations of the Americas. Before European contact, the Americas were largely isolated from the disease pools of Europe, Africa, and Asia, which had developed immunity to diseases such as smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus over centuries of exposure. Indigenous peoples in the Americas had no immunity to these diseases, and when Europeans arrived, they unwittingly brought with them pathogens that would decimate native populations. Smallpox, in particular, had a catastrophic impact. The first recorded outbreak of smallpox in the Americas occurred in 1518, just 26 years after Columbus's first voyage. It spread rapidly across the Caribbean and into the mainland, killing millions of indigenous people. The disease weakened entire societies, making it easier for European powers to conquer and colonize the Americas. Some historians estimate that up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas was wiped out by disease in the century following European contact. The effects of disease were not limited to the Americas. In Africa and Asia, where European explorers and traders also established a presence, diseases introduced by European contact sometimes caused localized outbreaks, though the populations of these continents had been exposed to Old World diseases for centuries and were more resilient. However, the spread of European diseases in Africa, combined with the transatlantic slave trade, had a devastating effect on African societies, as we will explore later in this chapter. The demographic collapse caused by disease had profound consequences for indigenous societies. Entire villages were wiped out, traditional social structures were disrupted, and the loss of so many people led to a weakening of resistance to European colonization. Indigenous leaders who had once ruled powerful empires or large confederacies found their societies in disarray, unable to mount effective resistance against European incursions. The conquest of the Americas. The fall of empires. In the early 16th century, two of the most powerful indigenous empires in the Americas, the Aztec Empire in Mesoamerica and the Inca Empire in South America, were brought down by small groups of Spanish conquistadors led by Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, respectively. These conquests were not just the result of military prowess, but were also aided by disease, internal divisions, and the exploitation of existing political rivalries. In 1519, Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico with a small force of about 600 men. At the time, the Aztec Empire, ruled by Emperor Moctezuma II, was the dominant power in Mesoamerica, controlling vast territories and a network of tributary states. The Aztecs were a highly organized and militaristic society, known for their impressive capital city, Tenochtitlan, which was built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Despite their strength, the Aztecs had many enemies, particularly among the subject peoples who resented the heavy tribute and human sacrifices demanded by the empire. Cortés, recognizing the political divisions within the region, forged alliances with these discontented groups, particularly the Tlaxcalans, who had long been at odds with the Aztecs. With the support of these indigenous allies, Cortés marched on Tenochtitlan, where he was initially welcomed by Moctezuma. However, tensions quickly escalated, and Cortés took the emperor hostage, sparking a violent uprising. In 1521, after months of brutal fighting, the Aztec capital fell to the Spanish, marking the end of the Aztec Empire. The fall of the Inca Empire in South America followed a similar pattern. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro arrived in the Inca Empire, which at the time was embroiled in a civil war between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, over the throne. The Inca Empire, like the Aztecs, was a vast and powerful state, with a highly centralized government and a sophisticated system of roads, agriculture, and architecture. However, the empire was weakened by internal strife and the spread of European diseases. Pizarro, with a force of fewer than 200 men, captured Atahualpa after a surprise attack at the Battle of Cajamarca. Despite the vast disparity in numbers, Pizarro's superior weaponry, the use of horses, and the divisions within the Inca leadership allowed him to overthrow the empire. By 1533, the Inca capital of Cusco had fallen, and the Spanish established control over much of South America. The conquests of the Aztec and Inca empires were symbolic of the broader pattern of European colonization in the Americas. While European forces were often outnumbered, they used a combination of military technology, alliances with indigenous groups, and the spread of disease to subdue native populations. The fall of these great empires marked the beginning of European dominance in the Americas and the establishment of colonial societies built on the exploitation of indigenous labor and resources. Resistance and adaptation. Indigenous responses to colonization. Despite the overwhelming challenges posed by European conquest and colonization, indigenous peoples across the Americas, Africa, and Asia did not simply submit to European domination. Many fought back, using a variety of strategies to resist or adapt to the new realities imposed by European colonizers. In the Americas, indigenous resistance to European colonization took many forms. Some groups, like the Mapuche in southern Chile and Argentina, engaged in long-lasting military resistance against Spanish forces. The Mapuche, who were skilled horsemen and fighters, successfully resisted Spanish control for nearly 3 centuries, becoming one of the few indigenous groups in the Americas to maintain their autonomy well into the 19th century. In North America, indigenous confederacies such as the Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia and the Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast formed alliances to resist European encroachment. These alliances allowed indigenous groups to coordinate their defense and negotiate with European settlers on more equal terms. However, these efforts were often undermined by European diseases, which decimated indigenous populations and weakened their ability to resist. In addition to military resistance, indigenous peoples also adapted to European colonization by incorporating European technologies, goods, and practices into their own societies. The introduction of the horse, for example, transformed the cultures of many indigenous groups in North America, particularly those on the Great Plains. Horses revolutionized hunting, warfare, and transportation, allowing groups like the Comanche and Lakota to become powerful, nomadic horse cultures that dominated the plains for centuries. In Africa and Asia, indigenous responses to European exploration and colonization varied. In some regions, European traders and missionaries were able to establish alliances with local rulers, leading to a degree of cooperation and exchange. In West Africa, for example, European traders established relationships with powerful African kingdoms, such as the Kingdom of Congo and the Ashanti Empire, which facilitated the transatlantic slave trade. These kingdoms used their alliances with Europeans to strengthen their own political power and access new goods and technologies. In other regions, indigenous peoples resisted European colonization more directly. In southern Africa, the Khoikhoi people, who were pastoralists living in what is now South Africa, resisted Dutch colonization in the 17th century. However, they were ultimately displaced by European settlers, who seized their lands and forced them into labor. In East Asia, the Chinese and Japanese governments limited European influence by restricting trade and missionary activities, maintaining their sovereignty for much of the early modern period. Cultural survival and revitalization. Despite the devastating effects of disease, conquest, and colonization, many indigenous cultures have survived and continue to thrive today. Indigenous peoples across the Americas, Africa, and Asia have preserved their languages, traditions, and spiritual practices, often in the face of intense pressure to assimilate into European colonial cultures. In recent decades, there has been a resurgence of indigenous cultural revitalization movements aimed at reclaiming and preserving traditional knowledge, languages, and practices. In North America, indigenous peoples have worked to revitalize their languages through education programs, language immersion schools, and the preservation of oral histories. In South America, indigenous groups have fought for land rights and the protection of their ancestral territories, particularly in the Amazon rainforest. The Age of Exploration, while marked by violence, exploitation, and loss for many indigenous peoples, also laid the groundwork for the global interconnectedness that we see today. The encounters between European explorers and indigenous peoples were complex and multifaceted, involving both conflict and cooperation, destruction and adaptation. The legacies of these encounters continue to shape the world we live in, as indigenous peoples reclaim their histories and assert their rights in the modern world. Chapter 6: The Legacy of the Age of Exploration on Global Trade and Economics. The Age of Exploration not only reshaped the cultural and political landscapes of the world, but also had profound and lasting effects on global trade and economics. As European nations embarked on their voyages of discovery, they sought wealth in the form of precious metals, spices, and other goods that would give them dominance in the rapidly evolving global market. The expansion of European trade routes during this period connected continents and laid the foundations for the global economy as we know it today. The legacy of the Age of Exploration is inextricably linked to the rise of European empires, the establishment of vast colonial territories, and the exploitation of both natural resources and human labor. The extraction of wealth from newly discovered lands in the Americas, Africa, and Asia fueled the growth of European powers and transformed the global balance of trade. In this chapter, we will explore how the voyages of explorers like Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Magellan changed the global economy and set the stage for centuries of European domination in trade, finance, and industrialization. The search for wealth: spices, gold, and silver. From the outset, the primary motivation behind European exploration was economic. European nations sought new routes to the east in order to bypass the overland trade routes controlled by Muslim and Venetian merchants, who had long dominated the spice trade. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves were highly prized in Europe, not only for their culinary uses, but also for their medicinal properties and their role in preserving food. The profits from the spice trade were enormous, and whoever controlled access to these goods would gain significant economic and political power. The Portuguese were the first to secure a direct sea route to the east, beginning with Vasco da Gama's historic voyage to India in 1498. Da Gama's successful navigation around the Cape of Good Hope opened the doors to direct trade between Europe and the East Indies, allowing Portugal to establish a monopoly on the spice trade. Portuguese traders quickly established trading posts in key locations along the coasts of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, securing access to valuable goods and dominating the flow of spices into Europe. The wealth generated from this trade made Portugal one of the richest nations in Europe during the 16th century. However, the Portuguese monopoly was soon challenged by other European powers, most notably Spain, the Netherlands, and England. Each sought to carve out its own share of the lucrative spice trade by establishing colonies and trading posts in Asia. The Dutch, in particular, became major players in the global spice trade with the founding of the Dutch East India Company in 1602. This company, one of the first multinational corporations in history, was granted a monopoly on Dutch trade in the Indian Ocean and established a vast trading network that stretched from Europe to the Spice Islands, modern-day Indonesia. While the spice trade was a key driver of European exploration, The discovery of vast quantities of gold and silver in the Americas soon became another major source of wealth for European powers, particularly Spain. In 1492, Columbus's voyage to the New World revealed an entire hemisphere rich in untapped resources, and the subsequent Spanish conquests of the Aztec and Inca empires in the early 16th century brought a flood of precious metals into European markets. The mines of Potosi, located in present-day Bolivia, became one of the largest and most productive sources of silver in the world. Spanish colonists forced indigenous laborers and later enslaved Africans to work in these mines under brutal conditions. The silver extracted from the mines of Potosi and other regions of the Americas was shipped back to Spain, where it fueled the rise of the Spanish Empire and became the backbone of European trade with Asia. The influx of gold and silver from the Americas had a profound impact on the global economy. In Europe, it led to a period of inflation known as the Price Revolution, as the increased supply of precious metals devalued currency and led to rising prices for goods and services. At the same time, the wealth generated from the exploitation of the Americas allowed Spain to finance its military campaigns and expand its influence across Europe and beyond. However, the impact of this new wealth was not confined to Europe. The massive quantities of silver extracted from the Americas were also a key factor in the expansion of trade between Europe and Asia. Much of the silver mined in the New World was sent to China, where it was used to purchase silk, porcelain, and other luxury goods. China, at the time, had a silver-based economy, and the demand for silver was immense. This flow of silver into Asia helped to integrate the economies of Europe, Asia, and the Americas, creating a truly global trade network for the first time in history. The rise of mercantilism and colonial economies. The Age of Exploration also gave rise to a new economic system known as mercantilism, which became the dominant economic theory in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. Mercantilism was based on the belief that a nation's wealth and power were measured by its stockpile of gold and silver, and that the key to accumulating wealth was to maintain a favorable balance of trade, exporting more than importing. To achieve this, European nations sought to establish colonies that would provide them with raw materials and serve as markets for their manufactured goods. Colonies were seen as essential to a nation's economic success, as they allowed European powers to extract resources such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and gold from distant lands without having to rely on trade with rival nations. Under mercantilism, European governments tightly controlled colonial economies, regulating trade and ensuring that the colonies served the interests of the mother country. The mercantilist system had far-reaching consequences for both Europe and the colonies. In Europe, it fueled the growth of the manufacturing sector, as raw materials from the colonies were processed into finished goods that could be sold at a profit. This, in turn, laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century, as European nations invested in new technologies and production methods to increase their economic output. In the colonies, however, the mercantilist system often led to the exploitation of both land and labor. European settlers established large plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas, where they grew cash crops such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton for export to Europe. These plantations relied heavily on the labor of enslaved Africans, who were brought to the New World through the transatlantic slave trade, which became one of the darkest legacies of the Age of Exploration. The Atlantic slave trade, which began in the early 16th century and lasted until the 19th century, was a direct result of the demand for cheap labor in European colonies. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas to work on plantations, where they endured brutal conditions and were treated as property. The profits generated from the slave trade and the labor of enslaved Africans played a central role in the development of European economies, particularly in the sugar and tobacco industries. The legacy of mercantilism and the colonial economies established during the Age of Exploration can still be seen today. Many of the patterns of global trade, exploitation, and inequality that began during this period have persisted into the modern era, shaping the relationships between developed and developing nations. The expansion of global trade networks. The voyages of discovery during the Age of Exploration led to the creation of vast global trade networks that connected Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. These networks facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, technologies, and cultures, transforming the world into an interconnected system of trade and commerce. One of the most significant developments during this period was the establishment of the transatlantic trade network, which linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas in what became known as the triangular trade. This system of trade was based on the exchange of goods, raw materials, and enslaved people between these three regions. European ships would transport manufactured goods such as textiles, weapons, and alcohol to Africa, where they would trade these items for enslaved Africans. The enslaved people were then transported across the Atlantic to the Americas in the horrific journey known as the Middle Passage, where they were sold to plantation owners. The ships would then return to Europe, laden with raw materials such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton. The triangular trade was immensely profitable for European merchants, but it had devastating consequences for Africa and the Americas. In Africa, the demand for enslaved people fueled wars and internal conflicts, as African leaders sought to capture and sell prisoners of war to European traders. Entire societies were destabilized by the slave trade, and millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homelands, leading to a lasting legacy of violence, poverty, and underdevelopment in many parts of the continent. In the Americas, the exploitation of enslaved labor led to the development of plantation economies that relied on the production of cash crops for export. These economies were highly profitable for European colonists, but they were built on the suffering and exploitation of millions of enslaved Africans, whose labor was essential to the success of the colonies. The wealth generated from the transatlantic trade system helped to finance the growth of European empires and laid the foundations for the modern global economy. While the transatlantic trade network was one of the most significant developments of the Age of Exploration, it was not the only global trade network to emerge during this period. European explorers and traders also established new trade routes between Europe and Asia, connecting the economies of the East and West in ways that had never been possible before. The establishment of European trading posts in India, Southeast Asia, and China facilitated the exchange of goods such as silk, tea, porcelain, and spices between Europe and Asia. European merchants brought these luxury goods back to Europe, where they were sold to wealthy consumers, creating a demand for Asian products that continued to grow throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. At the same time, European traders introduced new goods to Asia, including silver from the Americas, which became a key currency in the Chinese economy. The expansion of global trade networks during the Age of Exploration transformed the world economy and laid the foundations for the modern system of international trade. It also led to the rise of powerful trading empires, such as the Dutch and British East India Companies, which dominated global commerce for much of the 17th and 18th centuries. The long-term consequences of the Age of Exploration on global economics. The Age of Exploration had far-reaching consequences for the global economy, many of which continue to shape the world we live in today. The discovery of new trade routes and the establishment of colonies created a global system of trade that linked the continents in an interconnected web of commerce and exchange. This system facilitated the flow of goods, technologies, and ideas across vast distances, but it also led to the exploitation of land, labor, and resources in many parts of the world. The extraction of wealth from the colonies, whether in the form of precious metals, cash crops, or human labor, played a central role in the rise of European empires and the development of modern capitalism. The profits generated from colonial trade helped to finance the growth of European cities, industries, and institutions, while the exploitation of colonies created the conditions for economic inequality and underdevelopment in much of the world. At the same time, the Age of Exploration also paved the way for the Industrial Revolution, which would further transform the global economy in the 18th and 19th centuries. The raw materials extracted from colonies, such as cotton and sugar, became essential inputs for European industries, while the wealth generated from trade helped to fund technological innovations and the expansion of industrial production. In the centuries following the Age of Exploration, the global economy became increasingly integrated, with trade, finance, and production taking place on a global scale. The legacies of this period can still be seen in the patterns of global trade and economic inequality that persist today. Many of the countries that were colonized during the Age of Exploration remain economically dependent on the export of raw materials, while the countries that were the beneficiaries of colonial trade continue to dominate the global economy. The Age of Exploration, therefore, was not just a period of discovery and expansion. It was a period that laid the foundations for the modern world, with all of its complexities, inequalities, and interconnectedness. Chapter 7. The Age of Exploration and the Spread of Religion. The Age of Exploration was not only driven by the search for wealth, new trade routes, and territorial expansion, but also by religious fervor and the desire to spread Christianity to new lands. As European explorers ventured into the Americas, Africa, and Asia, they carried with them not only the ambitions of their monarchs, but also the religious zeal of the Catholic and Protestant churches. Missionaries, who often accompanied explorers and settlers, saw the newly discovered lands as fertile ground for conversion, viewing the indigenous populations as souls to be saved from what they considered pagan beliefs. The spread of religion during the Age of Exploration was a complex and multifaceted process that shaped the cultural and spiritual landscapes of the regions Europeans encountered. In some cases, the introduction of Christianity led to profound cultural exchanges and syncretism, where indigenous beliefs and practices were blended with Christian teachings. In other instances, conversion efforts were accompanied by violence, coercion, and the destruction of traditional spiritual practices. The impact of these religious encounters was profound and long-lasting, with Christianity becoming deeply entrenched in the Americas and parts of Africa and Asia. In this chapter, we will explore how religion, particularly Christianity, spread through the newly encountered lands, the role of missionaries in the process of colonization, and how indigenous peoples responded to these efforts to convert them. We will also examine how the religious motives of European explorers influenced their actions and the ways in which religion was used to justify conquest and colonization. Religious motivations for exploration. From the very beginning of the Age of Exploration, religion played a key role in shaping the motivations and actions of European explorers. For many of the Catholic monarchs of Spain and Portugal, exploration was seen not only as a means of acquiring wealth and power, but also as a way to expand the influence of the Catholic Church and spread the Christian faith to new lands. The spirit of the Reconquista, the centuries-long effort by Christian rulers in Spain to reclaim territory from Muslim rule, was a major influence on the early voyages of exploration. In 1492, the same year that Christopher Columbus embarked on his first voyage to the New World, the Catholic monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, completed the Reconquista with the capture of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain. This victory marked the culmination of centuries of conflict between Christians and Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula, and it reinforced the monarch's commitment to spreading Christianity beyond Europe's borders. The Spanish crown, in particular, saw the newly discovered lands in the Americas as a new frontier for the Catholic Church, and made the conversion of indigenous peoples a key priority. The papacy also played a crucial role in encouraging European exploration and the spread of Christianity. In 1493, shortly after Columbus's first voyage, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull known as Inter Caetera, which granted Spain and Portugal the right to claim lands in the New World and evangelize the indigenous populations. This papal support provided religious legitimacy to the Spanish and Portuguese conquests and established the Church as a central player in the colonization process. The spread of religion was not confined to Catholicism. Protestant nations, particularly England and the Netherlands, also viewed exploration and colonization as opportunities to spread their faith. As Protestantism spread across Europe in the wake of the Reformation, competition between Catholic and Protestant powers intensified, with each side seeing the newly discovered lands as a battleground for religious influence. Protestant missionaries, especially in the later stages of the Age of Exploration, sought to convert indigenous populations to Protestant Christianity and challenge the dominance of Catholicism in the colonies. The role of missionaries, agents of conversion and colonization. As European explorers made contact with new lands and peoples, they were often accompanied by missionaries, priests, monks, and friars, who saw themselves as spiritual pioneers, tasked with spreading the Christian faith to the farthest corners of the earth. These missionaries played a crucial role in the process of colonization, acting as both religious leaders and cultural intermediaries between European settlers and indigenous peoples. In the Americas, Spanish and Portuguese missionaries were among the first Europeans to make contact with indigenous populations, and their efforts to convert the native peoples were central to the colonization process. The Spanish crown, in particular, saw the spread of Christianity as a key justification for its territorial claims in the New World, and it established a network of missions across its colonies to facilitate the conversion of indigenous peoples. The Franciscan, Dominican, and Jesuit orders were particularly active in the Americas. These missionaries often lived among indigenous communities, learning their languages and customs in order to better communicate the teachings of Christianity. The establishment of missions, where indigenous peoples were gathered, baptized, and instructed in the Christian faith, became a common practice throughout the Spanish colonies. These missions also served as centers of education and cultural exchange, where European agricultural techniques, crafts, and technologies were introduced to the indigenous population. However, the process of conversion was not always peaceful or voluntary. In many cases, indigenous peoples were coerced into adopting Christianity, and traditional spiritual practices were suppressed or outright banned by colonial authorities. Spanish missionaries often viewed indigenous religious beliefs as pagan and idolatrous, and they sought to eradicate these practices through a combination of persuasion, education, and force. In some instances, indigenous religious leaders were persecuted, and sacred sites were destroyed and replaced with Christian churches. One of the most dramatic examples of this religious conflict occurred in the early 16th century, during the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs, who had a highly developed religious system centered on the worship of multiple gods, were seen by the Spanish as practicing human sacrifice and idolatry. The Spanish conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés, sought to impose Christianity on the Aztecs by force, destroying temples and replacing them with Christian symbols. The fall of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1521 marked the beginning of a systematic effort to convert the indigenous population to Christianity, often through violent means. The Catholic Church's efforts to convert indigenous peoples in the Americas were not without challenges. In many cases, indigenous peoples resisted conversion, either by maintaining their traditional beliefs in secret or by blending elements of Christianity with their own spiritual practices. This process of syncretism, where indigenous beliefs and Christian teachings were combined, led to the creation of unique religious practices that reflected the blending of European and indigenous cultures. One of the most famous examples of this religious syncretism is the veneration of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico. According to tradition, the Virgin Mary appeared to an indigenous man named Juan Diego in 1531 on the site of a former Aztec temple. The Virgin of Guadalupe quickly became a powerful symbol of both Catholicism and indigenous identity in Mexico, and she continues to be one of the most important religious figures in Latin America today. In addition to the Catholic missionaries, Protestant missionaries played an important role in the later stages of the Age of Exploration, particularly in North America. English and Dutch settlers, many of whom were motivated by religious freedom, brought their Protestant faith with them to the colonies. While Protestant missionaries were less focused on large-scale conversions than their Catholic counterparts, they still sought to spread their faith among indigenous peoples, particularly in the English colonies. Indigenous responses to Christianity, resistance, and syncretism. The spread of Christianity during the Age of Exploration was met with a wide range of responses from indigenous peoples, ranging from acceptance and adaptation to resistance and rebellion. In some cases, indigenous communities embraced Christianity, seeing it as a path to social advancement or as a way to form alliances with European settlers. In other cases, indigenous peoples resisted conversion, either through open defiance or through more subtle forms of resistance, such as practicing their traditional beliefs in secret. In the Americas, the imposition of Christianity often went hand in hand with the suppression of indigenous religious practices. The Spanish and Portuguese colonial authorities, with the support of the Catholic Church, sought to eradicate indigenous belief systems, viewing them as obstacles to the complete Christianization of the native population. Indigenous priests and shamans, who held significant power in their communities, were often targeted by missionaries and colonial authorities, and sacred sites were desecrated or repurposed as Christian churches. However, indigenous peoples found ways to preserve their spiritual traditions, even in the face of intense pressure to convert. In many cases, they adapted Christian teachings to fit within their existing belief systems, creating new forms of religious expression that blended elements of Christianity with traditional indigenous practices. This process of religious syncretism allowed indigenous communities to maintain a sense of continuity with their past while adapting to the new realities of colonial rule. For example, in the Andes, indigenous peoples incorporated Christian symbols and rituals into their traditional religious practices, creating a unique form of Andean Christianity. In some communities, the Christian saints were equated with indigenous gods, and Christian festivals were celebrated alongside traditional religious ceremonies. This blending of beliefs allowed indigenous peoples to maintain their cultural identity while navigating the pressures of colonial rule. In other cases, indigenous peoples actively resisted conversion and sought to defend their traditional spiritual practices from European interference. One of the most notable examples of indigenous resistance to Christianity occurred in 1680, during the Pueblo Revolt in what is now New Mexico. The Pueblo peoples, who had been subjected to Spanish rule and forced conversion for decades, rose up in a coordinated rebellion against the Spanish colonists and missionaries. The revolt was fueled in part by resentment over the suppression of indigenous religious practices, and the Pueblos destroyed Christian churches and killed Spanish priests during the uprising. Although the Spanish eventually regained control of the region, the Pueblo Revolt remains one of the most significant examples of indigenous resistance to European colonization in the Americas. The global spread of Christianity. Africa and Asia. While the spread of Christianity during the Age of Exploration is often associated with the Americas, European missionaries also sought to convert populations in Africa and Asia. In these regions, the spread of Christianity was met with different challenges, as missionaries encountered well-established religious traditions such as Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. In Africa, European missionaries began arriving in the early 15th century, particularly in regions along the west coast where the Portuguese had established trading posts. The Kingdom of Congo, located in present-day Angola and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, became one of the first African kingdoms to embrace Christianity. In the late 15th century, King Nzinga, a Nkuwu of Congo, converted to Christianity and adopted the name João I after being baptized by Portuguese missionaries. His son, Afonso I, continued to promote Christianity in the kingdom, and Catholicism became a central part of Congo's political and cultural identity. However, the spread of Christianity in Africa was often limited to coastal regions, and the interior of the continent remained largely untouched by European missionaries during the early stages of exploration. In many parts of Africa, indigenous religious practices and Islam continued to dominate, particularly in regions with long-established trade networks and Islamic schools. In Asia, the spread of Christianity was more complex. The Jesuits, one of the most active missionary orders, played a key role in attempting to convert populations in India, China, and Japan. In India, Jesuit missionaries such as Francis Xavier sought to convert both Hindus and Muslims, but their efforts were often met with resistance from local religious authorities. However, the Jesuits did find some success in southern India, particularly among marginalized communities who saw conversion to Christianity as a way to escape the rigid caste system. In China and Japan, the Jesuits faced different challenges. In China, Jesuit missionaries such as Matteo Ricci adopted a strategy of accommodation, learning the Chinese language and adopting Confucian customs in order to present Christianity as compatible with Chinese culture. Ricci's efforts won him the favor of the Chinese imperial court, and for a time, the Jesuits were able to establish a foothold in China. However, their success was limited, and by the 18th century, the Chinese government began to restrict the activities of Christian missionaries. In Japan, the Jesuits initially found success in converting local lords, daimyos, and their subjects, and Christianity spread rapidly in some regions. However, the Tokugawa shogunate, wary of foreign influence and the potential threat posed by Christian converts, began to persecute Christians in the early 17th century. The Shimabara Rebellion, 1637 out into 1638, in which Christian peasants rose up against the shogunate, led to a brutal crackdown on Christianity in Japan. The Japanese government expelled foreign missionaries and executed thousands of Japanese Christians, effectively ending the spread of Christianity in Japan for the next 2 centuries. The religious justification for conquest and colonization. Throughout the Age of Exploration, religion was not only a motivating factor for European exploration, but also a key justification for conquest and colonization. European powers, particularly Spain and Portugal, saw the spread of Christianity as a divine mandate, and used religious rhetoric to legitimize their territorial claims and the subjugation of indigenous peoples. The doctrine of discovery, a legal principle rooted in papal bulls issued in the 15th century, gave European Christian rulers the right to claim lands that were discovered by their explorers, as long as those lands were not already ruled by Christians. This doctrine provided the legal and religious framework for European colonization and the displacement of indigenous peoples, who were often viewed as heathens in need of conversion. Religion also played a central role in the justification of the transatlantic slave trade. European slave traders and colonizers used religious arguments to defend the enslavement of Africans, claiming that they were bringing Christianity to the enslaved and saving their souls. This religious justification for slavery helped to mask the brutal realities of the trade and provided a moral veneer for the exploitation of African labor. The religious motives and justifications of the Age of Exploration had a lasting impact on the world, shaping the spiritual, cultural, and political landscapes of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The spread of Christianity, while often accompanied by violence and coercion, also led to complex cultural exchanges and the creation of new forms of religious expression that blended European and indigenous traditions. The Age of Exploration was a defining moment in world history, a period of daring voyages, breathtaking discoveries, and profound cultural encounters that forever changed the trajectory of human civilization. What began as a quest for new trade routes, wealth, and territorial expansion grew into a global movement that connected continents, reshaped economies, and spread ideas, religions, and technologies across the world. For the explorers who braved the unknown seas, such as Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, Ferdinand Magellan, and many others, the Age of Exploration represented the spirit of human curiosity and ambition. They ventured into uncharted waters, driven by a desire to expand the horizons of their nations and their understanding of the world. Their journeys uncovered lands that had long been isolated from Europe, bringing new territories into the fold of European influence and power. Yet the legacy of the Age of Exploration is not one of pure triumph and discovery. It is also a history marked by conquest, exploitation, and profound disruption. For the indigenous peoples of the Americas, Africa, and Asia, the arrival of European explorers and settlers often heralded the loss of land, culture, and autonomy. The spread of disease, the imposition of foreign rule, and the exploitation of human labor, especially through slavery, brought untold suffering to millions. Despite the darker aspects of this period, the Age of Exploration also laid the groundwork for the modern world, fostering unprecedented global connections and exchanges. The Columbian Exchange introduced new crops, animals, and technologies that transformed societies on every continent. The spread of Christianity, though often coercive, created new religious and cultural expressions that blended European and indigenous traditions. And the rise of global trade networks set the stage for the modern economy, integrating distant regions into a system of commerce that would continue to evolve over the centuries. The voyages of discovery during the Age of Exploration also expanded human knowledge in profound ways. Cartographers mapped previously unknown lands, navigators charted new routes, and scientists studied the plants, animals, and peoples encountered during these voyages. The exploration of the New World and other distant regions challenged European conceptions of geography, biology, and society, ultimately leading to the development of new fields of knowledge and inquiry. As we reflect on the legacy of the Age of Exploration, we see a world forever changed by the encounters, exchanges, and transformations that took place during this period. It was a time of great wonder and discovery, but also of profound loss and inequality. The global connections established during the Age of Exploration continue to shape our world today, influencing everything from international trade and cultural exchanges to the political boundaries and economic systems that define our societies. The Age of Exploration reminds us of the power of human ambition and the drive to discover new horizons, but it also serves as a reminder of the responsibilities that come with such discoveries. As we look to the future, we can draw lessons from this period of history, lessons about the importance of curiosity, the potential for cultural exchange, and the need for respect and justice in the face of diversity and difference. In the end, the Age of Exploration was a story of humanity's reach beyond the known, a testament to the enduring desire to explore, learn, and connect. And though the era of wooden ships and uncharted seas has passed, the legacy of those voyages continues to resonate in our interconnected world, where exploration and discovery remain central to our collective human experience.